you know what I mean. All these factors need to be taken in consideration. It's not only about the volume of training. People always think the volume of the training is the only thing that can affect recuperation, which is not. You know,
Yeah, you have to minimize the amount of stress from all kinds of factors.
it's a very stressful job to be a professional combat athlete, whether you're a grappler, a boxer, a kickboxer, a fighter, and you need to be taken into account.
Is it more or less stressful than marriage? Just kidding. Next question. Um, so I don't know how to ask this question, given what George just said, but you're training 3 times a day and finishing, and what have you learned about what brings out the best in you as the elite level grappler?
So over the recent years, I've actually changed it up a little bit. When I was coming up through from white to black belt, I felt that the volume was the most important. So it would be anywhere from like 3 to 7 sessions a day, going from school to school, from New York to New Jersey. And I think that the volume was very important to build the skills, where I just didn't know how to move my body at purple belt the way that I should. So I think that building the skills is super important. I think that early on, volume is very important. Now that I already have the skills built, I think that acquiring more knowledge is the most important. So I find that if I do so many sessions a day, like if I do 3 sessions a day, I feel sometimes by the third session, I'm just like so mentally like there's so much information that's went through my head the first 2 sessions that I feel like I'm not even there mentally on the third session. So I feel like doing less volume now, but having more mental clarity per session is more important because I already have the foundational skills acquired.
So a lot of your training is almost like just thinking, like learning.
A lot of it, yeah. So I'll do like, I mean, our schedule's been messed up since the pandemic because Henzo's got shut down, and they were using a French gym in Puerto Rico, and now we're using a French gym in Austin. But once we have our own school, we'll have a set up schedule where I can pretty much just be there all day long. But right now, I do like a lifting session in the morning, and then I'll come in and help teach at Henzo's. So I'm there mentally. I'm seeing what's going on, and I'm playing around with ideas in my head. And then I'm there physically and very sharp mentally for the competition class during the 1 p.m. session. And then after that, I'll go home, I'll rest, and get ready for the next day.
What have you learned, John, seeing all these different athletes? Is there a universal rule that applies, or is it athlete specific?
Yeah. First, one thing that needs to be addressed is that George and Gordon play very different sports with very different athletic demands. Gordon can be in matches that range from anywhere from 6 minutes to literally hours long. As a result, the overall pacing and intensity of matches is massively different. Most obviously, there is no striking in Gordon's sport. Striking, by its very nature, is a much more explosive physical action than grappling is. Grappling is primarily an isometric kind of sport based around isometric tension and endurance. George's sport does feature a significant amount of isometric tension, but the majority of it is based around explosion. So the physical demands of the two sports are radically different. In addition, the time of application is radically different. George raised a very interesting point. His matches seem long, 25 minutes for a championship match. But always understand that a mixed martial arts fight at championship level, if it goes the distance, is really five-minute matches. Each round is a match in itself, and that's exactly how you're scored. You're scored by who wins the most matches over 5 matches. As a result, the application of the techniques, especially the grappling techniques, has to be done at a certain pace. As George pointed out, realistically, the maximum application time you're going to get in most situations is somewhere between 15 seconds and 3 minutes. Even for a specialized grappler like Damian Maia, there's still a significant part of each round which is spent in setup time to actually get the match to the ground. it's very likely that at some point your opponent will stand up out of grappling and you'll have to reinitiate the entire process again. So that even for specialized grapplers, you might be spending only 3 minutes out of a 5 minute round on the ground. And as a result, you've got to get your work done in a very short time frame. Gordon Ryan, once it goes to the ground, and it can go to the ground because he chooses to sit to the ground, may spend the entire match in ground positions. Um, as a result, the matches have completely different pacing and completely different physical demands, and the preparation that the two athletes go through will reflect that. Uh, if George St. Pierre, in training for mixed martial arts, becomes fatigued to a point where he's no longer physically in training for mixed martial arts, becomes fatigued. MMA training can be very deep indeed. Okay, if you make a mistake in mixed martial arts because you're fatigued and tired, and you take a full power roundhouse kick to the head, that's some deep consequences. A grappler doesn't have to face that. You can be completely exhausted in grappling and just sit in the bottom of the mountain, just practice just survival skills. We just don't get submitted from bottom out. And that can still be an effective training session. Complete and utter physical breakdown and fatigue can end an athlete's career in mixed martial arts. The consequences of training through fatigue in MMA are potentially very deep and very disturbing. The consequences of training through complete physical exhaustion and grappling aren't really that severe. Okay, you just tap. Whenever there's a problem, just tap. Um, and so they're very, very different sports in the way you prepare for them. And a grappling athlete like Gordon Ryan, we can take many more liberties with physical exhaustion and the amount of hours a day you spend in training than you could with a mixed martial arts athlete like
It can
George.
actually be a benefit, exhaustion as a framework of learning. So, like from a place of exhaustion, is there any benefit that you said being at the bottom of mount, sort of understanding jiu-jitsu or grappling somehow deeper because you're physically
Absolutely,
exhausted.
absolutely. Because then the only thing you have left in your favor is your technique, and then you'll see how technical you are. In addition, you'll get to explore realms inside your mind that we don't spend a lot of time in, and you'll learn a lot about yourself and your ability to endure, which will have potentially great benefits in similar situations and matches.
Yeah, there's I mean, for me, for a recreational person, getting exhaustion allows you the great benefit to experience what it feels like to really get dominated at an even greater frequency than you otherwise would. And there's something there. There's some animalistic thing that's very unpleasant. And then afterwards, it takes you to a place of like humility and I don't know, it forces you to rethink life in positive ways. There's something about dominance. Like, I mean, if you get dominated a few times, you can rationalize it somehow. You say, okay, well, I've screwed this up. But when you're exhausted and you have to do like 30 minutes or 40 minutes or an hour of just being dominated over and over and over, being submitted, I don't know. It's a very good process for other avenues of life. I find. I can't explain why, because I'm driving home, crying afterwards, listening to Bruce Springsteen, but afterwards, you this afterwards somehow you can think clearer. You can see clear about what is the right path through life, in all walks of life, like relationships, work, but also the grappling. Actually, the grappling is the hardest one to see what you have to do. It clarifies other avenues, the humility. It removes the bullshit. It's like we see the world through some kind of fog, and it just removes it, and now you can see things clearly. I don't know what that is.
I think it's important, like you mentioned, to push yourself. Like sometimes to see how far you can go, because sometimes you can go further than what you think, and it can boost your confidence. You know, you can push yourself through a certain limit, and maybe you thought your limit was before that point, and you pushed through it. But like John just mentioned, it's a risky thing to do in striking, because if you're exhausted, you're gonna get brain damage. In grappling, it's, you know, you tap if something wrong, but you can do it also in strength conditioning. I like to run track. I do it all the time in track and field. it helps me to know myself better. I think it's important. It's a good point.
And it's like the scrimmage wrestling rounds we do. It's like, you know, if you stop moving, that you're gonna get scored on, and you know in your mind, like, there's no mechanical reason why I should give up a score here, but you're so exhausted that you're like, oh man, this is terrible. That if I stop moving, I'm a pussy, and if I don't stop moving, I'm gonna be twice as exhausted when we actually do stand up. So it's an interesting game you have to play inside your mind.
It's your pride very often that keep you that keep you sharp. You know what I mean? Because you just want to lay down and beat it because you're completely exhausted. You know?
What do you think is the connection, John, between this ego pride thing, martial arts, and actual violence in our with our ancestors? Do you think you ever plug into that? Do you think there's echoes of something going on there, or like you mentioned, you have flaws and demons? Is it deep in there somewhere? Do you think we're struggling with those demons?
Yeah, you'll need to patch up your question a little bit, though. It's going in several different directions.
Wow, that was not only my being dominant in jiu-jitsu, I mean dominant in interviewing.
No,
You got
I'm not.
patched up that question.
It's that brother
true.
scene where they're like, okay, now we interview you.
But you went down the evolution.
Bob Lazar, what do you think?
No, I mean, do you I don't mean just the line between what is martial arts and what is violence. I mean, there seems to be a gray area that connects us to the evolutionary ancestors.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think there's a deep recognition in all of us that, and this is the evidence for this is so easy to see in daily life. If you're walking down the street and suddenly you hear a commotion and two people are fighting, you will see literally everyone on that street stop whatever they're doing and watch the fight. Humans are fascinated by violence, and you've got to ask yourself why. And of course, it's a recognition that for a significant part of our evolutionary history, violence was one of the most important elements in human existence. As much as we curse it, as much as we talk badly of it, the juxtaposition between humans' social nature and their need for each other to get along and to express love amongst the various members of a given community. There are disputes between humans that can't be resolved, and ultimately, throughout history, violence has been the number one method of conflict resolution, for better or for worse. And there's a recognition in all of us that this is where we come from, and there's a reason why combat sports have this thing where people will watch them and they might even be repulsed by them, but they find it difficult to take their eyes from it. And I do believe that most combat athletes carry that sense of their, even if it's on a subconscious level, this kind of belief that this is who we are. George used the word pride, and I believe that's a big part of it. I believe that most humans have this sense of self-worth and pride which they're willing to fight for. And if it gets crossed by someone else, they're willing to stand. Some people will stand more early, and some people will be pushed further back. Right? Everyone's got that line beyond which they won't be pushed. And there's some kind of deep recognition in all of us that we have that somewhere within us, no matter how hard we try to bury it or what have you. And that's why I believe there will always be this eternal interest in combat sports. Now, I don't believe that most people today have any kind of respect for unrestricted violence or non-consensual violence. I think most good people are repulsed by that, and I'm sure that as humanity improves out into the future, that will become more and more widespread. But that's not to say we can't exercise these old evolutionary demons inside of us, and sometimes there are just disputes between different people, different cultures, different nations, where ultimately it's going to come to into a shoving match, and that will degenerate further into violence. There's always going to be a need for humans to be able to express themselves through violent methods and to use physical force to get to their goals and objectives. Our need as humans is always to find a balance between the two forces of conflict and cooperation. We need cooperation because humans isolated from each other are more or less helpless and useless. In order to advance, human communities need to build and grow. And so that sense of cooperation occurs in most of our daily lives. But there will also be irresolvable conflicts where physical force has to be used to form a resolution. And so most human beings find themselves swinging like a pendulum between conflict and cooperation. And that is something which really gives birth, I think, to combat sports. Because, sorry.
Well, I really have to ask you about this then. There's a guy in Harvard named Richard Wrangham, and there's a lot of people that believe this. He wrote this book that basically there's a lot of people studying is what happened, how do we get from apes to humans, like what was the magic thing, right? A lot of people attribute it to fire and ability to cook meat. There's a lot of different theories. So he actually, his theory, how do I describe this, is basically that the beta males won. That the apes that were able to cooperate, the way you develop cooperation is there's a big bad leader that the alpha male that you can only knock off their throne if you cooperate. And so we built big tribes that just excel at cooperation by practicing overthrowing the leader. And so, and anytime an alpha male would rise up, we would develop our skill further and further of cooperation. And so we're all just beta males, the descendants of beta males. That's his kind of theory that cooperation is fundamental, and it's so distinct to the rest of the neighboring animal kingdom. So I wonder what you think about this tension of violence and cooperation, and how important is this cooperation to the core of
if you can look at it in a given training room, jiu-jitsu and mixed martial arts are solo sports. A solo athlete steps into the cage or steps onto the mat, but all of your preparation is done in a cooperative training environment with many peers, and as much as it's an individual sport, all of your preparation is done as part of a group. There's a sense in which that's an interesting metaphor for humanity itself. Everything we do in life we do alone, but we grow up in this given community and what have you. With regards to the whole alpha male, beta male thing, humans are, it's true, this fellow's correct. Most primates do have very strongly defined alpha males who rule the roost and determine the entire direction of the community they build around themselves. Humans, on the other hand, don't have an alpha male in that strict biological sense of someone who's responsible for the next generation, dominates all the female population, etc.
Physically dominating.
But we do, on the other hand, have our own version of alpha males as far as we have political and sociological leaders who have a disproportionate impact on the direction of a community. So
was the cooperation allowed us to have a greater scale of hierarchy with the alpha male on top and the alpha creature on top?
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating theory.
In nature, we're very weak as a species, so we need to cooperate in order to evolve. That, I think, made us the top of the food chain.
If you look at humanity in nature, really the two things that seem to, more than anything else, determine whether or not a given human community will be successful in a predatory world are numbers and technology. Okay, the more your numbers increase and the higher the technology of the weapons and support systems you have around you, the more successful you'll be in a predatory world. So it's not clear that just killing off the idea of an alpha male was the single biggest thing. The rise of technology and the growth of community after the imposition of language, these are other things that would have been very, very important factors in humanity's rise. George, you made an interesting point. If you look at humans, just the raw material of humans, we're nothing like that. And a predatory animal kingdom, we're just the absolute bottom of the food chain. We don't have a single effective weapon other than better than average endurance. That's about it. But you put us in a community.
It's not wrong.
Who can talk
Our
to each
endurance
other
is
with
pretty
language,
incredible.
Give us the
Like,
time.
I think I read somewhere about hunters in Africa where when
Technology
chasing an
such as
antelope or
metals,
something, or even a horse,
and suddenly a human.
it was always about keeping them
No
just
combat
inside.
effectiveness in the animal
Just
kingdom.
keep them
To
running.
a
Because
human
eventually to a
armed with a
point, those
simple
animals,
metal tip
they gas
spear
out. They'll
can
gas
kill
out before
and
you
any
will.
animal.
If you develop your endurance and you're running, you can
I'll beat your silverback. You know how? I'll fight him in the deep water.
like out
Just
endurance.
jump. Don't have to touch
You're not meant to keep up. Just keep it inside.
I gotta get him into the
Just to
pool.
keep it running.
You know why? Because someone told me, because I live in a community, someone told me that information, so I know we passed it on to me.
He taught you. Well, you have to convince him to. You have to somehow convince him to join you in the pool, which is very difficult.
Yeah, exactly.
It's very very difficult. From a technical perspective, John, you've looked at mixed martial arts, fighting in general, and grappling. What's the difference between fighting and grappling? That's something I'd love to ask all of you. Maybe John, you can start.
When you talk about fighting, you mean unrestricted MMA type fighting.
Yeah, I mean, you said unrestricted MMA type, MMA type fighting. So there's street
MMA,
fighting.
Yep.
There's MMA fighting, and then there's grappling, particularly the sport of grappling.
You're saying, okay, what's the difference between MMA and grappling?
Yes.
Okay.
See, that would have been a much better question.
Yes. The single. When you talk about grappling, you're talking about jiu-jitsu rules.
Yeah, I mean, you could maybe also mention different rule sets that somehow fundamentally change the sport.
In the sport of mixed martial arts, you've got two ways to inflict damage on the human body. You've got kinetic energy, which is done through striking, kicking, knees, elbows, and you've got isometric tension used along the lines of lever and fulcrum, which can be used for strangulation and joint breaking. In grappling, you lose one of those. You're no longer allowed to hurt your opponent with kinetic energy. You can do it accidentally through a throw, but you're not allowed to just knock someone out with a throw in most grappling sports. It can happen, but it's relatively rare, and it's not encouraged by the rule set. So, yeah, you got both. So there's a sense in which in mixed martial arts you've got twice as many problems to deal with, and they occur in a much shorter time frame. The single biggest difference between grappling technique as a weapon in human combat versus striking technique is time. Grappling technique takes a huge amount of time to apply. Okay, the great advantage of grappling technique is certainty of outcome. Once you get there, it takes a huge amount of time to set up a takedown, physically take them down, work your way towards a dominant position, culminating in your opponent's back, and then apply a stranglehold. That's a long chain of events, as opposed to a strong punch or kick, which can take a quarter of a second in application from start to finish, and the match is over. And so there's a sense in which grappling it's fighting for the patient and the calculating, whereas striking is much more for in this short time frame where everything gets done in the blink of an eye. There's a sense also in which grappling is a much more forgiving sport. You can make a terrible mistake, end up in a terrible position, and still fight your way out and win. In mixed martial arts, it's much, much less forgiving. If you get hit and stunned, your chances of recovery are minimal. You're going to get swarmed on, and unless it's right at the end of the round, it's very, very hard to recover from getting hit and swarmed on. So there's a sense in which the biggest difference between them is time for application of technique. In mixed martial arts, it's incredibly unforgiving in terms of time. Even the smallest error can have the deepest consequences. In grappling, you can make massive errors and still come back and win. Grappling will typically be won in a much higher percentage case by the more skilled and conditioned grappler, whereas there is much more of what they call puncher's chance in mixed martial arts, where there's a much higher likelihood of a lesser athlete defeating a greater athlete in MMA than there is in grappling, simply because of time of application of the techniques. Even the smallest period of inattention in MMA, and the match is over. Gordon Ryan could fall asleep for 30 seconds, have his opponent mounted on and wake up and finish him 5 minutes later. It's not going to happen in MMA.
Okay, so the stakes are much higher. You can do a lot of damage in a very small amount of time, and then just the dynamic, temporal dynamic of all this happen.
Everything you'll see will be a reflection of that. Then you go further into things like rule sets. In the sport of grappling, if Gordon Ryan comes out and sits down in the middle of the mat, his opponent must follow him to the ground and engage. In mixed martial arts, if you come to the center of the cage and sit down, the other guy can just walk away from you. They're completely oriented in different directions. Grappling is ground-centered. MMA is typically standing-centered. At the beginning of every round, you have to start standing again. If I disengage from a ground grappling situation, stand up and walk away from my opponent must follow me up to the feet. In grappling, it's the exact opposite. If I sit to the ground, my opponent must follow me to the ground. It's written into the rule set. And so one is inherently ground-oriented and one is inherently standing-oriented.
So it's more difficult to dictate where the fight happens in mixed martial arts.
Yes, you have to go to impose where the fight is, whereas in grappling you can simply choose it.
So, George, what is your sense of the difference between how you approach it between the two sports? So you also are a student of wrestling and grappling. So in preparing for fights, what parts of grappling, purely the sport, that you have to leave behind?
I'm very lucky. I had the opportunity to. I train with. I consider the best mentor trainer I ever had, and I have the best grapplers that I can train with. They were there to help me in my career. So my training is, of course, because I do not dedicate as much time in one specific area. It's hard to be, a world-class athlete in only one particular area. I always, for me, like the idea to be more well-rounded, to be very competent in every of those areas, striking, grappling, takedowns, and all those areas, than being just very good at one and not as good as others. Because I like the idea that it gives me more option. When I fight someone, I can mold myself to become the perfect nemesis to that person better if I'm more well-rounded. If I do not have those well-rounded skills, I don't have that option.
You have less tools to work with, less technology. What about you, Gordon? What do you think is very distinct about grappling and the way you approach it versus fighting?
I think most of it was covered, but I think that the one of the big things is the fact that when you're looking at MMA, you have a pretty general, agreed upon, and unified rule set. Where if you look at UFC versus Bellator, they have slight differences in the rules, maybe, but it's pretty much the same thing. Whereas in grappling, you have EBI rules and you have ADCC rules, you have IBJJF rules, you have no time limit rules, and each rule set will play to the skills of different athletes. If you do ADCC rules, it generally is slightly biased towards wrestlers, where if they can stall to the overtime and then hit a takedown in the overtime and not really do any jiu-jitsu, but they score a takedown, they're going to win. Whereas if you have like an EBI, for example, you have to finish the guy in regulation, or you start in a jiu-jitsu position with your back taken, or in an armbar. So I think that you have certain rule sets that play in the favor of certain athletes. And certain athletes can win in one rule set, but then they just have no chance of winning in the other. Like when I fought Yuri the first time in EBI, I beat him in EBI. The chances of me beating him on that night under an ADCC rule set were probably pretty low. When I fought Leandro Lowe under an ADCC rule set, he beat me that day, but the chances of him beating me in the same day in an EBI rule set were like next to zero. So I think it's interesting that in MMA you have one unified rule set which has small differences, but they're all generally the same. And in Jiu-Jitsu you have a wide variety of different rule sets that have biases towards certain athlete skill sets.
You mentioned Leandro Lowe. I gotta ask you again about ADCC. You have lost very, very few times in your career. This is the same is true for George. And the only person who has ever submitted you is Felipe Pena.
Black belt, yeah.
At black belt. He is ADCC world champion, multiple time IBJJF GMOG world champion. You may face him at ADCC or elsewhere in the future. Will you beat him?
Yes. I have to say yes, right? But I fought him initially when I first got my black belt. Then I fought him a year later, so 2016 and 2017. And despite what people remember about the match, and whenever people talk about it, like, oh yeah, the guy who's training with Gordon. But no one remembers that the first match was like a 45-minute war. And then the second match was the full 20 minutes of ADCC. And if I didn't get my back taken in like the last minute and a half, 2 minutes, it would have went into an overtime. That could have changed the outcome of the match. I think that if you look at Felipe's performances, especially Nogi, specifically Nogi, since then, it looks like he's almost gotten worse. Whereas since that match in 2017, the only match I lost after that was against Vinny Magalesh by points. And I'm on like a 55 match win streak over the course of 4 years, winning all the major tournaments, Nogi. And Felipe, since that match, I think is like 5-2 Nogi. And he's lost his last two matches. One was convincingly where he was dominated by Andre, and one was by submission. So I don't think that he's progressed nearly as fast. If anything, he looks like he's worse than he was when he beat me in 2017 based on his previous performances. That being said, I know he's going to come in training very hard for this one, and he's going to be prepared, but I just don't think that in terms of technical ability, he's anywhere near my level, and he was much bigger than me both times we fought. The first time, he was much bigger than me. The second time, he was one weight class above me. So now there's not going to be an advantage in technicality, and there's also not going to be a physicality advantage. So I think he's just going to be beat everywhere.
This is a good example of the scientific response to a comment, to a question. Yeah, so he's not. That's a match you're not deeply concerned with in terms of the set of opponents, because you have and you will be facing a lot of really different.
Yeah, that's actually, in my opinion, one of the easier matches because of the fact that we're relatively the same size. If I show up at 230 pounds, like a lot of the guys are 260, 270 plus, so that extra weight does make a difference. I think out of that entire bracket, Felipe is probably going to be one of the easiest matches because of the fact that I can easily take him down, and if I take him down, I'm going to pass his guard. Whereas I feel like the other guys, because they're so much bigger,
That's right, Dave.
very cagey,
Forearm
it may
training.
take me a while to actually
This is what I like to
take them to
forearm
the
train
ground,
to.
and get on top of them. And I think they may be longer, drawn out matches because of the fact
How are you
that
going
they're so
anyway
much
this
bigger,
Saturday?
Stally, it's hard to take them down. But Felipe's
Did you
relatively
follow my
size,
fixing
and,
the door
his wrestling is
experience?
atrocious. So I've already taken him down in the last ADCC match. So I'm pretty sure I can just easily put him down, pass him, and then finish him.
Well, I'm not sure what response I was expecting, but that was phrased beautifully. We talked about the Thiago Alves fight that George had, and John brought it up in class yesterday, I believe. But the point is, we're talking about wrestling, and I think that's a fascinating
Ah,
fight.
sick, man.
That is,
That's awesome. How far into it are you? I tried to replay it again after watching Edge Runners, but I've tried. I've already played it once. I'm probably just gonna wait for the next downloadable expansion or whatever, and then I'll get back into it. I'm probably gonna get into actually Resident Evil to release another expansion for Village, so I might play that later.
is an incredible display.
Good day for a nap, by the way.
The strategy of skill of heart. George, can you maybe talk about that fight, John? Maybe too. What lessons you gained from that fight? Go ahead.
Oh my
It
god,
was
my
your fight, not
chat
mine.
podcast so bad, you can't read that.
Well,
Or maybe it also tell what happened in terms of your injury.
oh yeah. So I was fighting Thiago Alves, and in the third round, I tear my adductor muscle. It happened when I was on the bottom, and I think he pushed my knee down, tried to pass my guard, and I heard that.
Yeah, Davin's telling me as well.
I don't know what
So
you
no,
were
I haven't.
from,
I've only finished
in
episode
your
1,
respect, you
but
switched
this
to
weekend
alpha
is where I plan
and
to
leg
catch up with it
pushing
all.
leg.
You and
You
Davin
went
have
in with
convinced me
pre-existing
to
injury in it for
get in on that. So yeah, hopefully by the end of this weekend I'll be up to date. But yeah, like I said, after the first episode, it was just so slow for me, personally. Like I don't know. But I was jumping on other stuff too. I just finished watching House of the Dragons, that Ring of Power, finished that as well. And I've been watching that new Bleach series also, that new Bleach anime. Just released this new season. But no, now I'm up to, Andor's what's left. So hopefully by this weekend.
Yes, and it got worse, and I heard that a pop. I don't know what it was, but I know it really hurt. So I came back standing up, and there's a
That's what I heard.
a famous video
Like,
one that goes.
Because
on
some of
the
my
internet
patients who are
about
Star Wars fans, they're
when
like,
I
yeah,
go
my
back in
kids
the
hate
corner,
it because, like, yeah, it
and
doesn't
I
have all
tell
the
my
flashy
coach, I'm
lightsaber.
like,
Well,
I
I don't
what
know.
it is. I think
Like,
I
supposedly
told
they don't have all the
my
your
adductor
typical
muscle.
Star Wars content.
Jackson is like, I don't care.
But I hear, yeah,
You're growing.
it's got a pretty good story, good narrative and whatnot.
I was very worried because I was in
So,
pain, but I did not know what I had.
Gonna be pretty
So
preoccupied this
I didn't
weekend
know the
watching that.
gravity of it, and it plays on your mind. So, but I had to bite down my mouthpiece and finish the fight. You know, I know I was ahead on the scorecard, and I needed to finish strong.
So what was your strategy there in terms of strikes, in terms of wrestling? So he's an exceptionally difficult opponent to take down.
Yeah, well, at first I knew I had a good jab, a good,
Yeah, that's it.
to stay always
Keep busy.
from the
Keep
outside,
busy.
fight him from the outside and use my footwork, because he was like a tank. He was much bigger and much stronger than me, and I never wanted to stay in front of him.
Yeah,
So it was
it's one way to
all the
put it,
way
you know.
out or all
It's all
the
about
way in.
balance.
And when I was coming all the way in, it was with my
Gotta make sure I give myself some
proactive or
downtime
reactive
once in a while.
takedown.
Sometimes
where
I focus too hard on my
myself
chiropractic skills and
initiated
developing
the
my techniques
takedown
and whatnot,
by,
and it get very
using
stressful
a
because like
distraction, like a
I've
jab
sort
to
of
make it
changed my
his
outlook
end.
when it comes to skill acquisition. I used to be very like always goal orientated, always like just focusing at the end, seeing like what the target is, what I'm trying to aim for. But it breaks you down because like there are some chiro techniques that are just bloody hard, and when you're just practicing and practicing and practicing for months and you don't even know if you're improving. Anyway, long story short, I'm now focusing on the journey more. I'm focusing on the steps towards that goal, which makes it a lot more enjoyable. Makes it a lot more, I guess manageable.
It goes up,
What's
and then
next
I
now?
go
Yeah, that's right.
with a single or double leg, or to react, like baiting him for
Right.
him to.
I was playing
hit
TFT,
me.
like I was playing a lot of TFT before, and thank goodness I've stopped doing that because that was taking away so much time. It was just like, too easy, quick gratification of just trying to kill time and then really not really doing anything. But yeah, it's fun and whatnot, but I like to do stuff that progresses. Ugh.
Using my strength. I think if you're very
Oh,
precise
no,
with the way
where
that
was
you
I up
train,
to?
I think the extra size and strength can help.
Shit. I wonder if I can watch. Wait. No! Ugh. I wonder if I could just watch one of my VODs to see what I was up to. I can't go back until I get off. I've done training. Done human nature. I've done that one. Talked about that. Maybe not today.
We talked about
Yeah.
the Thiago Alves fight that George had, and John brought it up in class yesterday, I believe. But the point is, we're talking about wrestling, and I think that's a fascinating fight. That there's an incredible display of strategy, of skill, of heart. George, could you maybe talk about that fight, John? Maybe too. What lessons you gained from that fight?
Yeah, that's it.
So
I've just got to
your
learn
fight
that I need
online.
to accept that some things
Well,
just
Or maybe
take time.
it also
Like,
tell
I've-
what happened.
I
from
full
you.
jump on Reddit and everything just to like, oh god, I did it again. I gotta stop pressing that back button on
Using high
this.
strength. I think if you're very precise with the way that you train, I think
There. Yeah. I even jumped on subreddits, man. Cairo subreddits. It's like, man, what I can just to get advice to see how I can improve and everything. And I'm like, my internet just died. It's interesting. But anyway, or my mobile internet. Yeah, they all say the same thing. It's just reps. That's it. And I listened to this other podcast named Andrew Huberman. He's like a neuroscientist, neurobiological scientist with like all the everything and anything that has to do with the brain essentially. And when it comes to skill acquisition, it's and if it's a technical, it's a physical skill. The most important thing is just how many reps can you fit in that amount of time that you're practicing. The more reps you can do, that's it. The better. That's it. And the reason why is because when you're doing those reps, you're making mistakes, and it's those mistakes that are getting you to progress. So the more reps you can do, the more mistakes you can make, and the more progress you're going to make. But the hard part with Cairo is it's not consistent with the target that I'm that I'm aiming, like the target as in I do adjustments on patients. If my patients stayed consistent as one singular type of human being across the board, it'd be easy. It'd be easy to figure out what I'm doing right or wrong. But the fact that my patients are all different, obviously, different sizes, different shapes, move differently, my target is always changing. So I'm always having to try to figure out my mistake around, yeah, like an object that's constantly changing. And it's hard to like figure out those little bits where I need to improve on. But that's the industry. Unfortunately, that is what it is. But yeah, just gotta keep pushing. My boss is like, yeah. He was hoping his outlook was maybe by the end of this year. That like I'm getting better in many areas, but there's still just certain techniques that I really want to get down. And he believes, yeah, maybe by the end of the second year, like maybe by the end of next year. But that's not abnormal. I was told that during the Cairo studies as well. Some people take, everyone just learns differently. Some people get it quick. Some people take 2. I've heard some people take 5 years. Is what it is. But the pressure I put on myself just gets toxic sometimes. But no, I've slowly dug my way out of that hole. But yeah, just gotta keep pushing forward.
We talked about the Thiago Alves fight that George had, and John brought it up in class yesterday, I believe. But the point is, we're talking about wrestling, and I think that's a fascinating fight. That there's an incredible display of strategy, of skill, of heart. George, could you maybe talk about that fight, John? Maybe too. What lessons you gained from that fight?
Go ahead. It was your fight, not mine.
Well,
Or maybe it also tell what happened in terms of your injury.
oh yeah. So I was fighting Thiago Alves, and in the third round, I tear my adductor muscle. It happened when I was on the bottom, and I think he pushed my knee down, tried to pass my guard, and I hear
It is. pushing
didn't know
forward,
what
and
to
listening
do
to these
then,
guys,
so,
like, you know, when these guys are like at the
You
top
were
of their
on his back,
game,
you switched to armbar,
and it's all about
cleared the
technical,
leg
physical
by pushing on
skills,
your
and
leg.
mental, of course.
You went in with a pre-existing injury and it tore.
Just making sure I'm following the
Yes,
right steps.
and
But yeah, pressure is definitely
it
good.
get worse, and I heard a pop.
It's a bit of a
I
balancing
don't know what
act,
it was,
bit of a
but I
balancing
knew
act
it,
there.
it really hurt. So
Too much, then I
came back
I
standing
start to
up, and
spiral in my own head, sort of thing.
There's a famous video one that goes on the internet about
It drives
when
you.
I go back in the corner, and I tell my coach, I'm like, I don't know what it is. I think I tore my adductor muscle, and Greg Jackson is like, I don't care, hit him with your growing. But I was very worried because I was in pain, but I did not know what I had. So I didn't know the gravity of it, and it plays on your mind. So, but
Sorry.
I had to bite down my mouthpiece and finish the fight. You know, I knew I was ahead on the scorecard, and I needed to finish strong.
So what was your strategy there in terms of strikes, in terms of wrestling? So he's an exceptionally difficult opponent to take down.
Yeah, well, at first I knew I had a good jab, a good, to stay always from the outside, fight him from the outside and use my footwork, because he was like a tank. He was much bigger and much stronger than me, and I never wanted to stay in front of him. So it was all the way out or all the way in, and when I was coming all the way in, it was with my proactive or reactive takedown, where
It truly is, because it's okay. Yeah, I guess it's just how you use that obsession. That's all. Because there are definitely a lot of moments, a lot of doubt with a lot of people. That's why, with some of the advice we've got from the Cairo subreddits, they say just keep at it. You'll eventually get there. Because a lot of people don't. A lot of people, that pressure and that doubt gets the best of a lot of people. There are a lot of Kairos out there who just don't do certain techniques because that technique is, like I said, that technique I'm trying to learn, it is very hard, but it is crucial as a manual adjusting therapist. And a lot of Kairos, they all don't work the same. Some just don't do that technique. And that's okay, there's nothing wrong with that, but this is something I want. I want to be that kind of therapist that can use those sort of techniques. So I just need to keep pushing at it to eventually reach that light at the end of the tunnel. Like, I need to, I gotta make sure I'm above, like, I guess that's my driving force. Like, that I'm ahead of everyone else that stopped. Oh yeah, I know. Like, makes so much sense, right? That's exactly it. That's exactly it. It's hard, like I said, it's just hard sometimes. Like, man, when you practice something for so long, and it's just like, man, am I ever gonna get this? But that's the process. That is the process. And what I love about Cairo is if anyone can do it, like if it was easy and anyone can do it, it wouldn't make it special. It wouldn't make it the profession what it is. It needs. That's why it is where it is. That's why it's a master's course. It's not easy. Some of the parts are, but there are certain things in there where it's just gonna take time, and that's what I love about it. That's the beauty of it, knowing that I'm able to do these certain things that other people can't.
Myself initiated the takedown by using a distraction,
10,000 more
to make his end goes up, and then I go with a single or double leg, or to react, like baiting him for him to come hit me, and then while he's coming to hit me, I go change level, and that's the way I like to take my opponent down. Some guys, for example, like Khabib, for example, he's very good at bringing his opponent to defense and use chain wrestling to take his opponent down. I find that for myself, I specialize more into explosive takedown in the center of the octagon because I found it more economical for me.
What did you see? You were commenting, John, about the wrestling. That was quite interesting. I mean, also, can you generally comment on the fact that George St. Pierre, I don't think you wrestled.
I started wrestling, I was 19 years old, but I wrestled some very good Russian guys, so they took me underneath their wing, but my ability to cover distance comes from karate, does not come from wrestling. Wrestling is how I finish once I get the leg, how I finish the takedown.
So the timing and the movement and the explosion
Correct.
required for the square.
I think an important distinction to make here is one which George made throughout his career, and I believe, George, you were the greatest innovator in MMA history with regards to this. And this is the creation of what George calls shoot boxing, which is the amalgamation of striking technique, in George's case, mostly karate, because that was his martial arts
Turn
background,
the aircon.
into grappling, and in particular takedowns. When most people say so-and-so has better wrestling in mixed martial arts, you have to be very careful what they mean by this. There are many highly credentialed wrestlers in the early days of mixed martial arts who went in and truly struggled to hit a takedown. Now, these are very, very good wrestlers who, in a wrestling match, would easily put down their opponent. But in a striking situation where the ranges are completely different and the setups are entirely different, the stances are different, even the overall conditions are different. You're no longer wearing shoes. People underestimate just what an impact it is for a wrestler to take their shoes off. You lose like 20% of your forward drive the minute you take off your shoes. All of these make massive differences in whether or not you're going to be able to even make contact with an opponent for a takedown. As George pointed out, the true value of wrestling in MMA is finishing the takedown once you've established contact, but that's only about 20% of the action of a mixed martial arts takedown. 80% of it is in understanding range, rhythm, setup, opportunity, etc., etc. And that's not part of wrestling at all. Even the overall conditions are completely different. In the sport of wrestling, you start at very close range in a very bent over stance, and you're expected to wrestle in international styles for 3 minutes at a time. Now suddenly you're completely upright, and you're not wearing shoes. All the conditions, the rhythm and speed of it is different. The counters are completely different. It's just an entirely different animal. And so George was an early recognizer of this and started to put the emphasis on direct training for shoot boxing in addition to wrestling. So he practiced with very good wrestlers in the Montreal Wrestling Club, just the sport of wrestling. And that's what made him very good at finishing takedowns. But it was in his shoot boxing training, which he himself largely developed. Remember, George started at a time when MMA was pretty damn young, and when you entered the sport of mixed martial arts, George, it wasn't even allowed on TV.
Cheers, Dave.
Like, it was
Thanks for
completely
stopping by.
banned. In
Take
this
care.
country, it was physically
Hope the
banned.
family's well.
They had to fight on Indian reservations. And I mean, this is way back in the Wild West days of MMA. And so as a young developing athlete, he had to more or less do this by himself. If you ever want to hear some incredible stories, talk about teenage George St. Pierre. Had a coach who used to make him put on boxing gloves. Now, he was 16, 17 years old, and just put him on a hardwood floor against a professional boxer who was in his late 20s at the peak of his career. And he said, George, you're not allowed to punch. You just got to take him down while he tries to knock you out. And it was crazy.
Darwinism.
Yeah.
He was like you're gonna adapt or you're gonna die. Literally.
And he adapted.
It could have been very bad, but it turned out to be great.
But there's a sense here in which people think, what determines your takedown ability in MMA is your wrestling skill. That your wrestling skill will determine your finishing ability on takedowns. But there's so much more to it than that. Whenever people say, what are the broad elements that determine the outcome of a mixed martial arts fight? Okay, on the broadest possible level, and I always give the same three things. The athlete who can dominate the pace of the match, the athlete who can dominate the direction of the match, and the athlete who can dominate the setups will win the vast majority of fights that they're in. Those three things, the direction, the pace, and the setups. You dominate all three of those, you're going to win 90% of the matches you're in. George could always dominate the direction of the fight because he could stop the other guy taking him down, and he could impose his own takedowns at any point in the match. So whether it went to ground or whether it stayed standing was always up to him. George had the most sophisticated array of setups into takedowns that I've personally ever witnessed. The whole distinction between reactive and proactive takedowns came very early in George's career, and he excelled in both. Most people tend to favor one or the other. Most athletes have a very hard time imposing their setups on an opponent, and as a result they have to use the cage as a crutch for their setups, where they just bully someone towards the cage and then put them down on the cage. George is one of the very few people who was equally good against the cage or in the open, and could do so in both proactive and reactive situations. And the scary thing is that as good as all of you saw him look in the octagon, anyone who knows George as a coach will tell you he was twice as good as that in the gym, where he would often go against people several weight divisions above himself. I could sit here all day, I won't name names, but I always laugh when people say, oh, this is the greatest pound for pound guy of all time, and I've personally seen George take that guy down and crush him in the gym, and I can't say anything. It's rude to talk about that in public. It's just training. But I've seen George go with people all the way up to light heavyweight, some of the greatest names in the history of the sport, put them down, advanced position on the ground, and dominate them in training. It's what he did during that time. George, I deeply admire many of the things I saw you do, not just in the octagon, but in training as well.
All right.
The impact
do
that
the
you
boring
had
thing.
on the degree to which takedowns were used in the sport was absolutely inspirational. That's why one of the reasons why I always say you're one of the only athlete I ever met who taught me more than I taught you, because you opened my eyes to a whole new world of shoot boxing, and how I grew up in a time when I was laughing before when you talked about Sugar Ray Leonard. I was a kid watching that match, and I grew up in a time where there was boxing and there was kickboxing, and then I came to America and I learned grappling, and this young man here was the innovator when it came to the integration of the two.
Well, then I have to ask, because George sits here uncomfortably being complimented. If George St. Pierre and Khabib Nurmagomedov face each other in their prime,
That's a very, very loaded question.
how?
Yeah.
Like, what are the different trajectories you see? Oh, okay, how does each one win, in your view? If one wins or the
That's a
other
better
one
question.
wins, what happens?
Interestingly, they're actually very similar in size, despite the fact that George fought at welterweight and Khabib fought at lightweight. If you actually see them stand next to each other, they're of similar height. Khabib's actually a little more thick-set. Yeah, he's actually heavier than you walking around. George walked around most of his career between 188 and 191 pounds. And so Khabib actually would, ironically, have a kind of size and strength advantage, despite being in the lighter weight division. That's been the general trend as MMA has grown, is that athletes will come further down in weight to make weight divisions. I believe that George has the best takedowns in history in the open, in the cage. Khabib his great strength was using the fence to facilitate takedowns. Khabib's other great strength was not only his ability to take people down, but to keep people down for extended periods of time. Both of them were powerful strikers on the ground and could do terrible damage to opponents on the floor. So they're both very similar in that regard. Khabib was mostly a puncher from the back. George is mostly an elbower from the front. But both of them could lay waste to opponents with strikes on the floor. Both of them were highly competent with submissions on the ground. They weren't submission specialists in the sense of someone like Gordon Ryan, but they were certainly no slouches with submission holds. Yeah, it's just a fascinating idea.
So it's almost like who gets the first takedown?
Yeah, I do believe that they could probably stand up on each other I don't think either one of them would be able to hold the other down for a whole round. Both of them are notoriously difficult people to hold down. So I don't think that whoever won the first takedown wins the match. I don't think it's like that. I do believe that George would hold a decisive advantage in striking and distance management. The few times that Khabib did look shaky is when Khabib was either advancing forward menacingly, but when he had to fight moving backwards, there was a definite asymmetry between his ability to fight going forwards, which is very good, and his ability to fight going backwards, which was noticeably weaker. George would often fight both forwards and backwards. So with Jago Elvis fight, most of the standing time, was going backwards. That's probably the single biggest difference between the two athletes in skill level would be in the standing position. On the ground, Khabib slight edge and takedowns on the fence, George slight edge and takedowns in the center. Ability to inflict damage on the floor, roughly equal. Ability to fight off the back,
I'm just stretching my
roughly
thumbs at the
equal.
moment. I'm just pushing my thumbs
Ability to
against the
stand up
desk.
from bottom, roughly equal. A very, very hard match. In terms of the biggest difference in skill level is going to be in the standing position. So it would come down to, that doesn't necessarily mean that Khabib would lose in the standing position. He might just push it to the fence and just use match tactics where he kept the fight on the fence for significant periods of time. And you can win rounds in that fashion. So it's a match that could go either way. Both of them are absolutely the best.
It's always good to train in front of
I
the mirror,
always
actually.
believe the three
And
greatest
stretch.
mixed martial
So you
artists
can
I've
always
ever seen in my life
look
were
at your form.
George St. Pierre,
Plus the
Khabib
aesthetics of the place
Nurmagomedov,
as well,
and John
isn't it?
Jones. The three of them have some interesting similarities and differences. All three beat every single person they ever faced. I know John Jones officially has lost by DQ, but no one believes that was a loss. George does have 2 losses, but he defeated both athletes decisively in rematches. Khabib did it by having no losses. Interestingly, all 3 athletes have at least one match which is controversial in terms of who won and who lost. John Jones has had several matches which could have gone either way on the judges' scorecard. Khabib's match against Gleison Tibau could have gone either way. George's match with Hendricks could have gone either way. They all had matches that they won, which people would dispute the outcome. So that was a similarity between the 3 of them. All 3 of them have had the ability to dominate the direction of fights. When they want it to go down, it goes down. When they don't want it to go down, it doesn't. That's why I put such a heavy emphasis on that idea that a mixed martial arts champion must be able to determine the direction of a fight. It's the single most important attribute that they all must have. As to which of the 3 is the best, it's going to come down to criteria. You can't pull them apart. Which answer you give as to which of those 3 is the greatest of all time will come down to the criteria that you use. Okay, is it being undefeated? Is it the amount of time? Was it the quality of the opponents that they had? If you do it by quality of opponents, I think you probably have to give it to George. If you do it by measured dominance through not being defeated, then it has to go to Khabib. Arguably, you could say the same with John Jones, since his one loss is by DQ, but then you could also say the last 3 or 4 fights that John's had haven't been the same measure of dominance as we saw previously. So ultimately, you've got those 3 guys, in my opinion, and which one you choose will come down to who. It says more about who you are as a viewer than it does about the respective level of the athletes. You could throw a blanket over them, the 3 of them are just that good, and which one you select will probably say more about who you are as a viewer than it does about them as athletes.
The GOAT is not even born. Because the generation that is present benefit of a huge advantage. They have knowledge, technology that we didn't have. And we have the knowledge that the other generation did not have before. But I believe the best, the GOAT, is not even born. As good as they are today, I think you, in sport where you can measure the performance, track and field, Olympic lifting, you know someone is better than the other one because you can measure the performance. Fighting is all subjective. We always debate on who would win, but the tendency in sport is that the performance get better. I don't think it's because the athlete necessarily get better. It's because they have access to better technology, knowledge, and they learn from their predecessor.
As long as that knowledge is transferred forward. So, something tells me that the greatest of all time lived a few thousand years ago, and it's forgotten. Some of the greatest warriors. Like, you imagine the kind of grapplers the history didn't record them. There could have been small tribes where they developed mini UFCs. And they've developed the kind of things you have to think of, like the Gracies. If the small family was able to develop so much so quickly.
I often have this discussion with John, and I think it's very important. Like you mentioned, I asked you several times, like, what would happen if we would take a fighter of modern days facing the champion of pancreation?
This is an interesting question.
And you brought some incredible good point, and people don't realize it. You know?
Yeah, no, I think one of the great tragedies of martial arts history is our loss of the historical records of pancreation. Like, most of what we know was, from what I'm told, is actually lost in the fires of the Library of Alexandria, and we're left with only a pitiful amount of information on pancreation matches. But what we do know is that there was a very large participation in the sport, and that it was widely considered the most popular sport in the ancient Olympics, and that it was represented in the ancient Olympics for many hundreds of years, plus a long period of time before its introduction into the ancient Olympics. And so the development time that it may have had would have been very significant. As far as we know, most of the development would have been in the major Greek city-states for literally hundreds of years of development. Given its prestige as an Olympic sport, then the best athletes would have been doing it. Some of the sharpest minds that we know of in human history were involved in the sport. Plato, the great philosopher, was a pancreationist in his youth. In fact, his name, Plato, is a nickname. Platus is plate. It means broad, big guy, the big guy. And he spoke often about pancreation in his written works. Imagine people with the intelligence of Plato thinking about grappling technique for hundreds of years in the most popular Olympic sport at that time. Significant numbers of people with financial backing as city-states put great prestige upon Olympic success. They would have funneled athletes in, brought in the best coaches, and they had that for many hundreds of years. Like, it's quite conceivable that the best pancreation athletes were of the absolute first quality. And it's so sad to think we'll never know what was the skill level. And
It's interesting to think about what kind of techniques they developed, whether there's stuff we haven't discovered yet. In class, you were talking about the most effective takedown strategy in wrestling, in collegiate wrestling. So maybe let me ask first, because we offline talked about this too. What is the highest percentage submission in rap?
overall, you have to go with the rear naked strangles from the back. If you look at most tournaments, most rule sets, it has success across all rule sets, all weight divisions, all body types. It doesn't require any kind of specific physical advantage of just height in order to be effective. It works equally well in both fighting and grappling. It will work regardless of how physically and mentally tough your opponent is. Okay, a heel hook is a very high percentage technique in modern day competition. But if your opponent simply makes up his mind that he's just not going to tap and is willing to take the physical damage, it won't result in the end of a match. A stranglehold, by contrast, will always end a match, regardless of your opponent's mental toughness. So, I believe it's fair to say that at the end of the day, the single most high percentage method of submitting people in grappling is a rear naked strike.
So when you look at an athlete, maybe Gordon, you can speak to this. Like, what's the best? You mentioned Gary with the guillotine. What's the best submission to really invest in? Is it the rear naked choke? To really invest your development, like understanding the entirety of the system that leads into that.
I think that, I mean, you have to do them all, obviously, but if I had, like, one submission only one submission I could pick for the rest of my life, it would definitely be a rear naked.
Can you explain maybe some of the actual technical details of why that's the case?
Well, as John spoke about, they're different in joint locks, whereas you don't have to tap. You can just let your leg break and then keep going with the strangle. There's there's none of that. And then it's just an inherent advantage you have being behind someone. Whereas if you go for an armbar, you start from top mount and you're facing the guy, then you put him down and you're not directly behind them. With leg locks, you're facing the guy. Whereas when you're on someone's back, you have them in a pin where you can your chest to back, you have a body triangle in, you're pinning the guy in place, he can't explode out, he can't grease his way out most of the time, and there's an inherent advantage you have being behind them due to the fact that we're poorly set up to deal with threats behind us.
So would you say that's the most dominant position in jiu-jitsu, like more than mount, more than back control?
I think if you look at most matches historically, most guys who get stuck in position for long amounts of time are guys with their back taken. If you get an explosive guy from bottom mount, he can bridge, he can off balance you and lock half guard maybe and work back to guard. But if someone locks a body triangle on your back, that's where you see most guys getting pinned in place for long amounts of time.
Was the body triangle like a well-understood thing? Was that an invention at some point, like as a system, as a control?
Perhaps some of your listeners can correct me on this, but I believe there was a technique banned in judo called dojime, which involved crossing feet or locking a triangle around the abdominals from the back, and it was banned in judo, I believe, because of intestinal injuries which occurred in the early developmental days of judo. And in the modern era, when I first began jiu-jitsu, body triangles were relatively rare. They were not a standard part of class. And sometime around the late 1990s, early 2000s, people started to realize, hey, this is a stronger method of control. It greatly increases the amount of control you have over your opponent's hips and torso over regular hooks. It's not for all athletes. It's difficult for most people who are of shorter, thicker stature to employ on big people. If your opponent's very broadly built through the stomach, it's almost impossible to apply. And so, because it can't be applied by all people, it tends not to be taught much at beginner level. So, as a result, it was always seen as a kind of a specialist move for taller athletes at a higher level of competition rather than a broad-based move for everyone, or every body type and every class to employ. So it just didn't get emphasized that much. But in top-level competition now, I think you would see that it's very apparent that the vast majority of athletes, whenever they have the opportunity for a choice between body triangle and regular rear mounts, the majority of modern athletes would choose a body triangle.
So we also had this conversation about wrestling. Maybe George, you can comment on like what's the highest percentage, not statistically speaking. Perhaps that's also interesting as John talked about, but just for you, in terms of mastery of a takedown, what's the best way to take down a human being in wrestling?
Well, I personally, for me, it depends. For every fighter are different. They have a different set of skill. For me, when I look someone who want to bring down a tree, a big, strong, high tree, cut it from the base. So the legs, that's what we stand on. So it was to attack the leg.
But is it single leg, double leg? Is it, we talked about like, there's also the John Smith low single. Actually, I don't even know if that's applicable for jiu-jitsu at all.
You can use it, but it runs into the problem with submission holds. It's not impossible to use, but without shoes and in a situation where there's a whole plethora of submission holds and scoring, it's a little more difficult to use.
it is interesting. Something being a high percentage in terms of effectiveness tells a story. You're saying that every athlete is different, but if it's more effective for most people, I mean, it's interesting. It's interesting. What John talked about is that the highest percentage thing is actually in collegiate wrestling that he was talking about is on the defensive side. So blocking a takedown and spinning around to the back. So that's an interesting idea. Then also there's all of these kind of going in for a single and then switching to a double, or wizard position and doing knee tap. Like there's all these kinds of combinations that seem to be effective if you look at the statistics. And it seems like there's maybe it's a scientific way of thinking, but it seems like there is some conclusion to be drawn there.
Oh yeah, I believe you need to. The high percentage move. There's a reason why it works. I think it's made for a bigger amount of people. For example, I one of my main strength, athletic strength is I'm an explosive person. So I use techniques that are explosive. If I get a single leg, one of my thing I like to do is to go for the double, power double. But for someone else got, for example, in a single leg position, maybe he likes like body throw better. He's more a Greco guy, like so, or he's a judo guy. He's gonna go for something else. So, but there is moves that are, I would say, like you just mentioned, are universal. Like statistically speaking, the highest percentage move that works for pretty much everybody. Everybody pretty much can do an adaka jimmy. You know, it's very easy. But it's not everybody that can lock a triangle with their legs. So those move like a rear naked choke, like a Jimmy is the highest percentage move because it's maybe more accessible. It's accessible for a bigger range of
Based on the physical characteristics of the people. Do you draw on your wisdom from these high percentages, John, for like in terms of what to focus on?
Yeah, absolutely. Jiu-Jitsu has an ocean of moves, and you can get lost in that ocean. You can drift for a long period of time and end up with very little to show for it. So my whole thing is focus. We only live one lifetime, and your training lifetime is even shorter than your actual lifetime. So in that time, I put
die on the mat.
that's true. I put a very high value on choosing what I believe to be the most high percentage moves and putting an extraordinary amount of focus on them. The only problem is that in one generation, a move which can be considered low percentage might actually turn out to be high percentage in another generation. For example, we talked earlier about leg locks. When I was first started jiu-jitsu, they were considered the ultimate low percentage move. And a big part of my career has been convincing people that, in fact, that was incorrect, that they can be a high percentage move if we just change our approach to them. So we can't just follow tradition and say, oh, this is low percentage or this is high percentage. It has to be part of
Next time I do this
a
stretch, I'll
fairly
probably,
systematic
say
study
what I'm
where
stretching as well,
you
just to help anyone else
investigate
who's watching.
what are the reasons why it's high percentage or low percentage. With regards to takedowns, if you look at what we can consider the most high percentage takedowns, if you're in front of someone, the single most high percentage way of taking them down is to get a hold of both of their legs and push them backwards. Okay, if you get a hold of one of their legs and put a force on them, they can use their other leg to defend themselves and hop around and funk their way out of takedowns and cause all kinds of problems for you. I don't care how athletic your opponent is. If you get a hold of firm grip of both of his legs and start pushing him backwards, he's going to fall down to his butt. Now, he might be able to recover from there, but he will fall down. Even easier than that is to be behind someone. Takedowns from in front of someone are difficult. You go right into their hips, their head, their hands, you go into all their defensive weapons. If you're already behind someone and you're doing what in America they refer to as a mat return, this is significantly easier than taking someone down from the front. If you have control of their head in the front headlock position, you've already closed distance on your opponent. You already have close contact. You don't have to worry about shooting anymore. There's no sprawl out of that. You don't have to worry about guillotines, kimoras, or the standard defenses. Those will intrinsically be easier takedowns out of front headlock. And so if we're going to talk about high percentage technique, I always go back to the mechanics of it, rather than just historical tradition, because historical tradition can be wrong. So it's wrong about leg locks. be wrong about other things too. So my primary thing is, okay, talk to me about mechanics. That's what ultimately is going to determine whether something is high percentage or not. Gordon pointed out earlier that when you're behind someone, you have innate physical advantages over the other guy. The human body is set up entirely to defend threats from the front. We are poorly adapted to defending threats from the rear. We don't have eyes in the back of our head. We can't apply pushing strength backwards. If you get behind someone, takedowns are 10 times easier from behind someone than they are when you're in front of someone. If you have to take someone down from the front, get a hold of both of their legs. If you can get a hold of both of their legs and impart a pushing force, you will almost always knock them down. If you can get a hold of their head and work takedowns from there, again, it's much easier because most of their defensive apparatus has been taken away from them before the takedown even begins. And so, for me, the most high percentage takedowns will always be from the front, double leg. From any takedown from the back is going to be significantly easier than any takedown from the front. So all manner of mat return takedowns are going to be very high percentage. And takedowns done out of situations where the opponent is broken down in front of you and you have either front headlock or front chest wrap position are going to be significantly easier than takedowns from the open.
Of course, you have to consider the full spectrum of mechanics involved here. It's possible that an outside low single leading to a double leg is a much higher percentage. There's a lot of chain wrestling yet, that needs to be considered as a possibility. Maybe a straight on double. And part of this cultural too. Are people afraid of this kind of thing? That they came to be the case with leg locks. Are people aware of this? Are they worried about this? Are they training for this to defend this? And then there's opponent specific, of course, that with Jordan Barros, people are preparing for the double, which is why he had to develop a whole other kinds of different stuff. And then the head to all the different controls, all the different ties within the rule set. And that's where it's so fascinating to see the effective rule set in all of this. Judo, over the past, I think, 20 years, went through this every Olympics, different changes to the rule set, like fundamentally different. In terms of what's allowed to grip, whether you're allowed to touch the legs at all. That was a big one in 2012, I think. And that changed the sport completely. It's so interesting to watch how a tiny change in the rule can change the sport at the highest, when you're talking about people competing at the highest level.
I like holding something
And
like this one.
the cool thing there is the rule change happens on a scale of every 4 years. So you get to see people that are at the top of their game have to recompute. So it's not like you have a new generation of people coming up with the rules. They have to figure, oh shit, you're not allowed to. It's the equivalent of saying you're not allowed to kick anymore in MMA. Because you were not allowed to grab legs anymore in judo.
Interestingly, if you look at the case of judo, if you look at the world rankings of athletes, when they went through one of the most significant rule changes in judo history, where they banned any form of grabbing the legs, the ranking of athletes didn't change much.
Yeah, that tells you that
There's a reason why those guys are at the top.
yeah, and it doesn't have to do that they're specific to a rule set.
Yeah. Think about that in terms of, imagine, for example, in mixed martial arts, if they just said, hey, starting next week, instead of having 3 5-minute rounds, it's going to be 15 minutes straight. That would massively change the preparation of the athletes. It's a different game at that point. And judo literally was a different game before 2010 and after 2010. And yet, the international rankings didn't really change that much. The countries that were dominant before remain dominant. The athletes that remained before largely remain the same. You would think with such a massive change, all the rankings would have been thrown upside down, but they weren't. And again, it goes back to this idea that there's a reason why the guys at the top are at the top.
And now for something completely different, we're talking about aliens. Right? Say George brought up Bob Lazar. I will likely probably talk about Lazar on this podcast, and then John had a skeptical look on his face about aliens. Well, so let me ask John and Gordon. Do you think there's intelligent alien civilizations out there in the universe outside of our own?
the universe is unimaginably large. The idea that we are the only life forms in a cosmos as large as this is, I think, naive and foolish. There's a very high likelihood that if life could evolve on this planet, that it could have done so on many, many other planets around the cosmos. I think anyone who puts even a moment's thought into this would realize that there's almost certainly other forms of life out there. The real question with regards to the alien community is, have they got here and are they circling our planet in little silver sources and making observations and periodically stealing people for experimentation purposes?
Doesn't have
That's
to
a
be
whole lot.
silver saucers. It could be different other color saucers.
And that question, I'm not at all convinced. No, I didn't. Recently, Navy footage has come out showing some very interesting phenomena. If you talk to almost any experienced pilot, they will tell you they've seen things in the upper atmosphere that are very difficult to explain. I'll be the first one to agree with you on this. There are some things out there that are extremely difficult to explain.
Like literally UFOs, unidentified.
Yeah, I mean, we just don't know what they are. But to
Pushing up
go
the
from
ankles.
the idea that
Sort of like a
there's things
forward
out there that
lunge.
we don't understand to
Either have your hands against the desk
Yes.
or against the wall. And next time I'll explain everything. I don't know why.
creatures running around.
I'll be honest,
that,
I've only been on the stretch program for the
somehow
last 2 or
exist.
3 weeks. And
I just reserve judgment. I just say I'm agnostic about these things. I think it's possible, but all the evidence that I've been shown so far was insufficient to come to any kind of definite conclusion. Until aliens land in Central Park on Tuesday afternoon at 3 p.m. and get out with little alien ray guns and start shooting people, I don't believe in many of the stories that get told.
Well, what about if it's not little aliens with ray guns, but something very different, very, very difficult to detect for us humans? That's very human
Again, which at that point it's a fascinating idea and it's certainly possible. Show me the evidence.
All
That's
right.
it.
What about you, Gordon? Do you look at the cosmos and ponder the stars often?
I think it's fair points John raised. Something really interesting I saw the other day was someone posted like if an alien organ or civilization 65 million light years away somehow managed to look at Earth, they would theoretically see the dinosaurs because they're 65 million light years away. So like imagine us looking at galaxies that are 100 million light years away. That's 100 million years ago. You have no idea what it looks like now. So that's what's super interesting to me about it.
Yeah, the expanse is huge, and so much cool stuff could be going out there.
Yeah.
The scary thing, of course, is if they haven't visited us yet, there has to be a good reason for it. And the set of scary reasons involve the fact that they maybe once you get sufficiently advanced in your development, you destroy yourself naturally, as humans seem to be approaching now. We more and more have the tools to destroy ourselves completely in terms of our weapon systems. And we're developing them more and more, and they're becoming better and better. And then we're starting to get angrier and angrier on Twitter and Instagram at each other.
That's a good point to raise.
Yes, there is that has that everything that lives one day will die. We will perish.
One day, yeah.
There's also just the sheer difficulty of travel through space. Like space is an unimaginably inhospitable environment, and to the best of our knowledge, even the theoretical speeds that we can attain in space, even if we could travel at the speed of light, we're not even remotely close to that. Still, the distances that need to be traveled to get to even relatively close solar systems are very, very long. If you look at astronauts who have spent significant amounts of time in space just orbiting the Earth, it has severe health effects on them. We're just not built for space. We're supposed to be in a gravitational environment.
By we, you're referring to your biological meat bag that's containing the essence of the mind that is John Danaher. Maybe we can transfer the mind alone. The bag, the meat bag is not designed for space, but maybe the
But again, this is all
contents of the mind is.
it's possible. But
What do you
this
think
isn't
of
concrete evidence for that.
you folks who like difficult things? What do you think about Elon Musk going to colonize Mars? Is this something you find interesting or a aimless pursuit?
I think it's somewhat our salvation. We need to leave at some point the planet because historically in the past we know that we've been bombarded by asteroids, volcano. There's crazy things happen here. It's very unstable. You know, if you look at it through a lifetime of a human being, it's nothing. But just look 12,000 years ago, what happened? You know, so there is cataclysm that happen all the time. It's very unstable. So if we want to survive as a species, I think we need to get out, to be able to get out and spread our seed.
So these are the early steps in a really long journey. But is there something about like, you know, we don't get that exploration in most of modern society. You know, the kind of exploring that people did throughout the centuries of, you know, coming to the North America, throughout, we were shrouded in physical uncertainty, what's out there. And now we get to do the same kind of exploration with Mars. Is there any aspect of you that wants to travel out to space, that wants to travel to Mars? You know, the goal is to allow civilians to travel, perhaps in our lifetime, meaning affordably. You can do so now, unaffordably.
Traveling to space and traveling to Mars are two different things. I think I would like to travel into space. I don't know if I would like to travel all the way to Mars.
Because of the risks involved?
Just because.
Boring? Is there some part of you that enjoys
I think that if I was like towards the end of my life, I would like to travel to Mars.
Because it would be nice to die on Mars.
Just the experience, yeah. But if I go to Mars, I'm not going back. I think that's it.
One-way ticket. Maybe with the technology we have now, maybe in the future, maybe our children of our children will be able to experience that.
Well, the
weekend on Mars.
Well, the whole design of the Starship that SpaceX is working on is supposed to come back. It's supposed to be reusable, so it's not a one-way ticket. That's the whole point. It's always going back and forth, back and forth.
What's the time frame between two planets that you travel from?
I think the current thing, you'd be stuck on Mars for 2 years.
But how long does it take to get from Earth to Mars?
Oh, it's pretty. I'm not exactly sure. Like, I don't know, on the scale of months, not scale of years.
You might not be healthy when you come back. You know, all the astronauts, they experience health issues. You know, they lose a lot of muscle mass, bone density. So, yeah, I don't think the technology is good right now.
Alright, I just think I finished my stretch program. As on average, it does take me about, I think, not too much, 35 minutes. I've got a timer there. Anyway, that's it for today. I'm done. Cheers to you all. I'm tired. I don't know why this stretch is. It's been good. It's been good. Not knocking it. The best way I can describe stretching is it's nice to move without feeling impeded. Is the best way I can say it. To shorten it down. Anyway, I think that's everything I stretched. Calves, hamstrings, back, rhomboids, triceps. Oh no, there's one more. There is one more. One last one. The one that I tell people for desk workers to do. Maybe, I don't know if you've ever seen it probably, but it's essentially this.
Let's say that.
If it is, I would love to be doing it for a weekend. If it's safe, I would
Well,
love
you're
to
also
be the
essentially,
first one
I got my hands on
for a
the
professional
elbows on the
fighter
table,
who sacrifices.
and I just keep moving back as far as I can, so essentially my arms are going up, further back I get, and I'm straightening out my thoracic spine. And as I straighten out, I'm pushing my chest, I'm aiming it towards the ground to accentuate the stretch. If I had a side view, it'd be better for you guys. Maybe I can find a picture and put it up somewhere.
Body, something like. So there's some sacrifice we do in that, right?
I don't want to be the first. I wouldn't want to. I leave the other one, but when I know it's safe, okay, count me in.
So one of the things that people say, and this is something I wonder
This is
about,
probably the
is
last stretch.
it's like having children or something. Once you see,
So I keep
once
going
you're
back.
out in space and you
My
look out
elbows
and
go
you
up.
see Earth, you look
My
back at
chest
Earth,
goes
it's an
towards
experience,
the-
it's not like anything
I try to
else.
push my chest
You
towards
can't
the floor.
replicate it here.
I hold it for
just
about a
look
minute.
back at that, like,
Every stretch I did today, 1 minute holds.
It's nerve-wracking.
You always want to hold for at least 30
Like,
seconds.
you see like Earth disappear into the distance.
30 seconds to a minute to be
yeah,
effective.
disappear.
But if you want to be
into the
sure,
distance, and
1
then you
minute.
get this extra stand on Mars and see And just the look, you're standing on the ground and you're looking out and you see the planet from which you came and where you might not be coming back. But there's a challenge to the whole thing where the risk is tremendous. And I don't know, I find that risk really compelling for some reason, but that could be just the exploration. Like, I guess that's a genetic thing too. How much do you want to explore?
There's a sense though in which,
A great
even in the
stretch if
best
you're a
case
desk
scenario,
worker.
where they did get the technology to whisk you to Mars in a fairly short period of time, it's kind of an inauthentic sense of exploration because your participation in it is no more exciting than your participation in an airline flight to a foreign country. You're basically, you didn't have anything to do with the creation of the vessel. You're not in command of the vessel. You're not in any way, shape, or form important to the mission. You're just a person sitting in a passenger seat. And you get off in a destination the same way you would if you flew to Singapore or London or someplace like that.
Well, there's
So-
a hierarchy of there's a leadership, and
But
then
essentially
there's
that
a bunch of
stretches
people that all
out.
have roles.
So like
You
that
don't
on
get
the
to go to
table,
Mars
going back,
without having
just
a
bring my
skill
back
set to
up.
But if you
Straight
made
my
it sound
back.
like space tourism.
Great
So
stretch for
you
desk
had a
workers.
ticket.
I think
And
it's a
anyone
long
in general,
time if we
you
have
know,
space
everyone
tourism
these days.
to Mars,
You've
we
got,
have
like,
nothing to contribute.
This usual posture,
Like
exaggerated.
you will have to
So what do? You go through like a training program.
Gets the
you
message
go-
across.
training
If you do that
program,
one for
and
about a minute,
there's technical.
be pretty helpful. Anyway, I think that's everything. So I've done my flexors, extensive. If there was one stretch that I still don't do enough of, it's biceps. And there's an interesting bicep stretch where I don't recommend to patients only because when you do it, you're sort of hanging on your thumbs. But it's the best bicep stretch personally that I always find. I don't do it every day, but essentially all you're doing is this. So essentially all you're doing is you put your thumbs, turn your hands inwards, thumbs there, and I'm going forward now. And anytime I need to stretch biceps, this is the best stretch personally that I find. Just be careful with your thumbs obviously, because yeah, if you don't hold and brace properly, you're gonna have a bad time. Oh my gosh. Cramp in my chest. But if I had a desk or something to better so I don't have to crouch down. But essentially our biceps, they don't just do this, they also do this. So what you want to do is extend that as well. Oh well, since I'm here I guess I'll hold it for a minute.
So things you'd be contributing. So they would bring people, you know, in terms of agriculture. I don't know.
Okay, so this is better. This sounds like they're more like explorers. Like if you talked before about explorers in human history, where Magellan sets off on his boat, and every person on the boat has a
Probably learned
specific
this stretch
function.
about a decade
They
ago.
were all into the mission in a very authentic fashion. If they
Always
weren't on the
stuck with
boat,
me.
the performance of the crew would somehow suffer. So this sounds much better.
And with Magellan, I think most of the crew died.
A significant number did, yeah.
And from bacteria. I mean, from things that are unexpected and so on. And if we discover life on Mars, I mean, who knows what that entails? Because that's like a manned mission to Mars would likely be very driven by the research to do all the kind of exploration required to find life.
Now, from Mr. Musk's point of view as a developer, presumably there has to be some kind of financial incentive here too. Is there some kind of financial benefit to Mars missions? Is presumably there wouldn't be that many people on Earth that could afford a ticket to pay for the kind of research and development that would require this. Is there some kind of mining on Mars of minerals that would be useful?
I think there's a lot of answers to this, but the only honest answer is the one that looks back at the human history, where we did a lot of things just because we could. A lot of hard things just because we could, and that led to a lot of innovation that ultimately made our life better. So this is why you have NASA, this is why you have government organizations. Like, what's the purpose of NASA? NASA would answer that by saying, okay, well, we're helping launch.
So now I think I can honestly say I've practically stretched every muscle in my body. I'm sure there's a small little tiny muscle in the figure if I haven't, but not as necessary. So if you go through that, I've done my forearm training for today, stretching now. Yeah, if you go through it. Next time I do the stretching, I'll make sure to explain it better, tell you exactly what muscle I'm stretching and everything. But I did pretty much stretch every single. Yeah, I stretched every single muscle today. I'm pretty sure. Pretty sure. Yeah. Anyway, that's enough.
Satellites up there, all the, they'll have a bunch of answers, but the reality.
Anyone who's here, thanks for joining, thanks for chatting, thanks for following, subscribing, the usual mumbo jumbo. And take care and have a good weekend. Cheers.